So you published a piece of writing on our Substack, which I would encourage everyone to go read, especially if you're listening to this podcast. I don't know if it matters if you read it before or after, but we're kind of going to explore a lot of the topics there. And you started it by asking, how does one ask a question online? You go on to say that, it appears increasingly that the reason we film our conversations is that there are fewer and fewer places in which conversations happen, quote unquote, naturally. And that, they're still part of this social theater. And then you sort of compare it to, revolutionary France. And I think that there is an idea that, I guess my big question is, if recording is no longer, supplemental, but in fact central and maybe overtly necessary, does it maybe dispel the idea that people will sometimes say, not everything needs to be a podcast? I think that there's often an idea, especially on the left probably, that it's kind of like, Lenin or Trotsky wouldn't be out podcasting. They'd be on the front lines and they'd be giving real speeches and really doing the hard work in a non-performative way. But I think all of this is performance, and it's in fact often it's ennobled and legitimized because of this performance. And I wonder if we can speak a little bit about that, maybe.
Maybe it's good to talk a little bit about revolutionary France. I spoke about sort of cafes and sort of early cafe society. Of course, there were the aristocratic salons, but there were also cafes where people would kind of respond and react and have conversations on, out loud, and anyone might participate in them. And there was even an expectation that strangers might participate. I think that is definitely performative. I mean, you can get very theoretical and say speech is performative and human society is a great performance, but I don't think that should be treated as a kind of cynical appraisal. I think the idea is that, adding a dimension of social theater, recognizing, say, that you're engaging in advocacy or persuasion, or that there's a certain media that you go through. Like, why is a march where people are marching and crowds gathering more real than meeting online? I mean, it's not apparent to me that one is more real than the other, because, take the, whether it was the French Revolution, whether it's the Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of those revolutions in part were liberal revolutions. They're like revolutions in which our first concepts of personhood, of private property, of radical equality, of the modern state are given like they're fully fledged versions, which we still very much have today, and is the basis of law and justice. Sure. and commercial society.
Yeah, well, honestly, for me too, getting back to that, I think revolutionary France, a central piece of that is the Rousseau text, right? The social contract, which opens with the super kind of poetic and like great piece of prose. Man is born free, and everywhere he's in chains. And it makes me think about, you reference a film in the article where there's a scene where someone is asked about the fading beauty of a rose. And the quote is, the rose grows entirely unaware, and although the elements may treat her cruelly, she knows nothing of it and continues to her end without judgment on her beauty. And then the king, who's asked this question, says, if such a rose could speak. And there's this element where nature itself becomes rhetorically conscious, right? And is given this platform, this stage, and it kind of becomes rhetorically conscious in a reflexive way. And the Rousseau quote is kind of interesting, because I'm not totally sure if he was making this point, but it's once that happens, once you're sort of asked to speak about the thing itself, or the thing is asked to speak about itself, it's like we lose the natural state, right? So Rousseau's free man is it's like the natural state is a myth, right? I almost think this is where it differs, maybe in the tradition that he's following in of the Greeks, that it's it only becomes visible when it's lost, which is something that I don't know that people talk about in this way. And I almost think that is in some ways maybe how we're talking about the in-person protest, or the idea of a very material way of performing, is that in some ways it's this idea that you weren't performing that there's some version of like advocacy or activism or whatever that's like without an audience or isn't performed in some way, like is only revealed to us through this performance and like this knowledge of performance, and that maybe people are thinking about it in the wrong way.
Well, people imagine that a performance is not real, but then they don't really know how to describe what is real about a performance. And definitely, I think they rely upon this myth of the natural thing.
Yeah.
Of something that pre-exists, say, maybe even societies, particular laws or precepts or
Right.
moral ideas. I mean, like Rousseau is an early theorist of liberalism. He's someone that certain people will turn to, sort of like people will turn to John Locke in England in thinking about their own sort of liberal revolution. And yeah, there's the myth of the person, you know, that's given adept philosophical and legal foundations. And the idea that personhood is a performance is, I think, probably quite a popular idea nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we're all performing. And I'm not interested in this concept of performance. I'm not interested in performativity as somehow all that is really going on.
Right.
This is not the idea at all, but nor is the idea that there's something natural and pre-given. Again, take the protest, you know, the really existing revolutions or social revolutions of the 19th and early 20th centuries. I mean, when people are bound together by symbolism that they've invented, you know, social goals that have emerged out of the thoughtlessness and symptomatic characters of society itself, you know, when there's just sort of invention upon invention, you know, and you're trying to, like, if anything, when you think about a Lenin figure, I see someone trying to kind of strike through in a certain kind of paradoxical way, a certain level of performance.
Right.
But not to get at the real thing, not to get at this great fiction of liberal personhood and again, private property on which we're supposed to base our emancipation.
Mm-hmm.
And this concept of there having been a certain free state we had, which we lost as a really existing history.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's the thing, is that it's like, I think that, I don't know that Rousseau was missing this point, but maybe sometimes people who are reading that are missing that point, which is that the free man only appeared retroactively once a certain version of society had really existed, or once like a version of liberalism and personhood was beginning to take shape, even as an idea. Then you could see it in contrast to this thing. But when that whatever free man thing was existing, I mean, first of all, wasn't necessarily really existing outside of, I don't know, you know, Neanderthals with no society, but that it was only able to be qualified in this way retroactively, and that it is essentially like a myth or something that didn't really exist, but only exist almost as like a thing to compare to this version of reality that we're living in now.
It's a myth that helps structure something about society. I mean, this is again why, if you think about, again, the cafes, you know, days before the Bastille is stormed, what are they talking about? You know, are they talking about, you know, changes in conversation, changes in mood? Are there growing crowds? Has somebody released a particularly inflammatory pamphlet?
Right.
You know, and it's like, okay, so we have pamphlets and we have human mood and we have crowds.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a play, but not in this kind of deflationary sense that, well, again, it's fake. And we have to get at some kind of, either we have to posit a very big fiction like Rousseau, or we have to engage in real politic, right? We have to engage in this kind of crass practicalism.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're deluding ourselves.
Right.
And I think that the fact that a myth can structure, the fact that kind of sort of both can be true at once, you can have a really interesting state. The fiction of freedom is also a rather dangerous idea, that just pursuing it, right, as they attempted in the French Revolution, for instance, they attempted to like install radical equality. They wanted to find the kind of materialism, right, that would be equal to this freedom that maybe people had sketched theoretically, and I think, and in a bigger sense, which I'm sure we'll get into, existed through commercial society, through the kind of, the materialisms that already existed, independent of the political ideals.
Yeah.
So this kind of self-conscious representation of society, and its capacity to be free, or again the very modern idea of freedom as a kind of absolute category of agency, of collective agency. This was again an idea that structured, though.
Yeah.
It helped. It both helped people to understand what was possible, what was going on, and it served as a kind of roadmap for, I guess, setting up the stage of society, if you will.
Right. Well, I also want to clarify too the idea that there wasn't this element of performance or even like a concept of an audience. I think that that's also a thing that people maybe mistake in the internet era, that it's like, everyone is aware of themselves almost as like a brand, or we know how much more often we're perceived, or we can look at the like count and the view count and all these things, that it like almost takes away from something, that it's like less, you're less engaged because you're engaged in this like this kind of screen of the digital, and then you have to do the thing, you have to perform in this way. But like the salons are kind of just a piece of society that existed, but more formally, I think about, to contrast France with America, there's like the Revolutionary Congress, right? And these were people who would dress for the occasion and write speeches and then would perform them as like pieces of rhetoric. And it wasn't only for the debate between, the representatives of the states and of the colonies, but it was also that they were performing them for an audience that they knew wasn't present, right? Like the pamphlets and the newspapers and the dissemination of information was totally still present, right? Like if John Adams was going up and presenting his case or his idea, he was in many ways performing it for an audience that wasn't necessarily in that room, that would receive the information later in other forms. And I don't think that was that much different than someone, recording a video or a podcast or making a television show. I don't think it was as simple as, well, this was just a guy who really believed in his ideas and was really smart, and so got elected, and then went and just said what he felt without, any illusions or any structure or any weird, whatever. Like, I think that is like a pretty simplistic view of the way that things used to work, and it for some reason I just think it devalues the digital in a way that I don't really understand why that's the goal. But I think that people forget that there's always kind of been this kind of framing device for things like rhetoric or speech or performance that were totally intertwined with our ideas of agency and politics and society and change, that I don't think that we've lost. We've kind of just built upon with new technologies.
But this is the paradox, isn't it, of the internet or of the digital? It's kind of like a black box. It is material, and it seems to make us do a lot of performing.
Right.
In fact, we're sort of uncannily and very anxiously aware of how much we're performing, but we don't seem to trust our own performance.
Right.
There aren't enough sort of spaces for social theater that seem furnished, so to speak,
right,
with those kind of really existing set pieces.
Yeah.
To give a kind of sort of contradictory phrase, the really existing set pieces of the pamphlet, the crowd, the city mood.
Right.
So the digital invites like a paradox there, and it's also it's what gets us to this question of why is it that people get so uncomfortable about this idea that maybe, right, especially politics involves an element of recording, involves an element of it sort of has to be captured photographically in order for it to exist. And obviously you can go and look at, has this impulse ever existed in history?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, yeah, constantly. I would say probably for as long as we've ever had history, we've had this kind of impulse to record that seems to kind of come from nowhere. That is sort of the pressure of meaning or the pressure to be real, that nonetheless has to be reflected through this imaginary audience, which you mentioned with John Adams, this audience that it doesn't really exist. It doesn't need to be, it's a capital A audience, right? It's
right.
The concept of someone listening to me.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the interesting questions as well is, where does this idea come from, maybe in its more modern sense, of something listening or watching me?
Yeah. Well, that's sort of the thing, is that it's like archiving is almost secondary to the function of like what I would just call staging, right? Like speech or rhetoric needs a stage to kind of legitimize it. And, you know, I would almost say that the function of the pamphlet or the newspaper or the telegraph, like, yeah, it archives it as like a secondary function, but knowing that something will be translated into newspaper, podcast, video, whatever, like gives it that dimension of the stage. Like in the same way, it's like the rose becomes noble once it performs for the court. It's like the same thing kind of happens, right? It's like that knowledge. And I guess I would say also, to tack onto your point about what sometimes maybe makes people uncomfortable with the digital, is like, you know, these other forms of staging, whether it was the court or the salon or the revolutionary pamphlet, or even, you know, like the book, like you wouldn't walk out of one room of the salon where there was a great political debate happening, and then in the next room there was like an ad for a Temu, you know, piece of crap, like projector for your phone. Whereas on the digital, like there's such kind of like an omni like use to these things, like as everything becomes more of like an everything app. I wonder if that maybe adds to people's uncomfortability with it, of like, you know, you always see the tweets that are like, I think that scrolling through reels and seeing like my niece mature, and then, you know, bombs being dropped on Iran, and then an ad for a gym near me is doing irreparable damage to my brain. Like, I wonder if that explicit kind of like context and contract that's been removed maybe removes people's like idea of this thing as a real social tool, or of like a legitimate stage in this way. That's at least kind of my feeling.
One thing we should avoid, though, is imagining that there were once really existing performances, whereas now we're just sort of performing in a fake way. This is just to repeat the kind of illusion I think we're trying to get ourselves out of.
Totally.
I mean, for instance, the salons were probably an example of the most extreme ignorance that coincided with the most extreme vanity and performativity in the worst sense. I mean, the scene which is quoted in the text is from a film called A Little Chaos, and it's about the Sun King. It's about Louis XIV at Versailles. It's about this age in which there was so much artifice at work, in which not even a rose can exist without having to not just explain itself, but the rose has to somehow play the almost erotic game of producing a certain kind of speech, or you know, somebody like the gardener woman who sort of monologues for the rose has to sort of engage in or is sort of temporarily puppeteered by the rose. And I think this is interesting, that this is what expresses a fascination of that time nonetheless, at least as it's fictionally reconstructed in this film, which is a very recent film, that there was still a fascination with objects, right, and a fascination with materiality. And one thing that strikes me about the digital is that it seems more material than many of the things that we compare it to. And I suppose this is one of the little dialectical reversals that we're trying to get to here, is to say, well, look, yeah, that crowd gathering is full of social performance.
Totally.
Sure. I mean, let's be honest. The Bolsheviks were full of unbelievable vanity as well. You know, unbelievable temperamentality of purpose. You know, there was not a strong or unified sense of what they were going to do once they got power. Whereas the digital, which again seems to be for us the ultimate sort of finger pointing at us and saying, you're guilty, and we're trying to sort of explain why we feel this guilt. Whether it's in this sort of schizo-affected version that you explained, with people going onto the internet and it just feels like a giant ad, because of course it is an appendage of commercial society. And maybe that's something we should talk about in a bigger terms, how the digital has become commercial and why that seems like a bit of a Frankenstein's monster vis-a-vis maybe what its purpose can be. But that the digital is the most material in that it seems to kind of like repeat materiality in an extremely kind of concentrated way. It takes all of those things that we mean by performance, but which also, in a kind of weird coincidence, have to do with everything we mean by materiality.
Right.
Like, remember, the crowd, the mood, the pamphlet, the wig. We're probably one of those sort of rarely quite dematerial societies. You know, our clothes are fake. We don't wear wigs. And of course, maybe to our credit, we don't think that we should wear wigs anymore.
Totally.
And I think that there is some political insight to the fact that maybe wigs are not exactly the way to get back performance. But what it's about is a relationship between performance and material.
Yeah.
That they seem to completely coincide and intersect. That what we mean by the stage pieces, say, of political theater are also what we mean simultaneously by the kind of really existing material constraints and or props, if you will, of society and social reality itself.
Right. Well, this, I think we can maybe go into a part, like I have some questions that I want to ask that are related to this, but yeah, it's like materialism, like almost used to mean, like sort of like, things that are really based in reality, right? Like real objects, all of these things. But then like once we get the digital where things can be represented in like a very non-material way, it's like materialism to me now almost means like, you know, the installation of a system where even matter is structured through sign and simulation and perspective and performance, right? So like the example that you talk about a little bit is like, you know, a book isn't just a book anymore, right? It's like a retrospectively coded object because you've made a decision to produce and print and bind something that could be Googled. Whereas before that wasn't necessarily a decision, right? Like that materiality was, I guess, like a little bit more innocent, maybe, because it was less of a choice, maybe, or it was just more, yeah. Whereas now it seems like it is a real decision to make something digital or non-digital. And you talk about this, right? You talk about this in the text where like this reimagining of materiality is not necessarily like a criticism or an attempt at, you know, saving something. Because you talk about, well, we should still produce books, but I really like the example you give, which is basically, you know, let's say you're reading a biography about someone. Like I'm reading a biography right now about James Brown, the soul musician. And I bought a book and it's amazing. And it talks about his life, but it talks about his life in narrative form, like a story, like a real story. And so when I'm reading this book and I'm turning the pages and I'm feeling it, I'm taking it with me on the metro and taking it with me when I go to the park or whatever. And I live my life. I'm like living my life, reading about this guy who is living his life. And it's kind of part of it. And it sort of just makes sense in that way as a book. But if I wanted like maybe a more data-based or factual account of this person's life, then maybe I would want a Wikipedia page that would say, you know, he was born in Georgia, and then there's a hyperlink to Georgia, and I can read everything about Georgia. And maybe I can even read about how the economy of Georgia changed in this way. And so it's not saying that we either need to have a book or need to have a Wikipedia page, but maybe that there's like more of a decision that we can make now because materiality is like an installation of these things as choices.
Well, I think the internet repeats materiality in that it allows us to see all of these things as material. It allows us to look back, 5, 6, 700 years and see that all of the objects that we've produced with the use of markets and commercial society and capitalism, this explosion of objects and things, was itself the event. It was not as though we'd been making objects or products or what we call commodities, and then we just found a really good way of doing it.
Right.
You can talk to certain people who are quite revisionist, and then they'll say, well, haven't markets existed forever? Doesn't capitalism just mean competition? Mm-hmm. And therefore, what they imagine, the sort of modern period of human production just began when we started to do things quicker. But for instance, that might be maybe the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, which is about 500 years, or not quite, after capitalism had already begun. It took hundreds of years of some other things. So clearly it's not good enough to say that objects, in the sense in which we mean it in the modern way, just existed. And so what do we mean then when we say that a kind of maybe an object was born? And how does the internet kind of finish a certain, I don't know, a process or a history of objectivity, a way of thinking about objects, the society of objects, as it were, around, for which we've created economics and industrial sciences, so as to coordinate this as a big amount of human effort. So I don't know if the internet is this installation as such. I think it definitely has to do with decision, strongly. But what is this decision that we suddenly get to make? What is this kind of perspective that we suddenly have? I mean, one of the things that you can immediately notice with, when the commodity starts coming out, and literally it's like there's this birth of an object that is like 360 degrees. That's literally what happens. Suddenly, you don't just have wool that you shear from a sheep in a kind of, to put it in terms of your James Brown example, sort of like that you carry with you.
Right.
You're a sheep farmer and it's part of an embodied practice of living. And you probably shear the sheep yourself, or it gets turned into something by a weaver, and it becomes something else. But there aren't necessarily clear values, for instance, associated with any of these processes. It comes down a lot to what a person is willing to value in the moment. There are no big relationships in terms of commodity prices between the wool, the land, the labor time of the weaver. In other words, economics has simply not appeared.
Right.
And we're talking about 700 years ago.
Right.
But then all of a sudden, wool is an object.
Yeah.
So, and this is what I mean by...
Well, because a kingdom, eventually once we start sectioning off kingdoms, they can be valued, right? If England is this much land and there are this many sheep on it that produce this much wool, and wool is worth this much, then it's like this piece of land is worth this much. This, person who has these serfs is worth this much. It becomes so much more intimately tied to these things.
Well, you can begin to give a strict monetary value to the land. You can say the land makes so and so amount of money per so and so amount of sheep in a given year.
Yeah.
And of course, you also have the birth of finance, which means you have the birth of the capacity to produce levels of money and debt that can basically underwrite these financial descriptions of reality. But so therefore, what you have is a sort of coincidence of financial descriptions of reality with this 360-degree object. And again, I'll explain it as, if you look at wool, it's not about an embodied practice or a process that passes from hand to hand, weaver to user, and maybe even is sold on a market, but the market is not equal to society. It's an independent transaction. Kingdoms still work by conquering, and maybe if they're very modern, they engage with trade, or they have some mixture of both. But there's always this kind of sort of get out of jail free card in terms of medieval sort of pre-political economy, in which conquering remains the how wealth is negotiated. But suddenly this little thing that you can carry in your pocket, this 360 degrees thing. And again, it can be anything now. The piece of wool gives you the piece of land, and then that gives you the value for your tools. Then your clothes have value. Even, again, our time starts to have a value. And I don't think this is a bad process. I think this is an extremely interesting process, because actually I think that at this moment, and again, you can sort of peg it in about the 13th century, because you can look at a series of different countries, city-states, places like Siena. You can look at laws that were passed in the 1280s in England, when it became possible to negotiate land exclusively as a commercial transaction, which was literally impossible in the feudal system of the Normans, which had been in effect for 220 years at that point. But yeah, suddenly anything can be itemized, and you have the birth of materialism.
Right.
Which is an extraordinary event. Like people, again, they think that objects have already existed, or that materiality has already existed. And maybe you can see it in fits and starts, just as you can also see the project of kind of radical freedom in fits and starts. You can go look back at the Romans and you can see a pretty radical concept of freedom, or you can look at Christianity to see a radical concept of freedom. But how these things get defended and performed and materialized, of course, becomes a rather important question, because these unions tend to fall apart. What didn't happen with market society in the 13th century and very much into the present, because we're still very much, I think, within the continuum of market society, or maybe we've only exited it in the last decade or so, last 20 years since, you guessed it, the birth of the internet. This has been able, this sort of 700 years or more of history and political society has reinforced literally materialism, materiality.
Right. Yeah, there's a point, there's and you speak about it a lot in the piece of writing, where and we use it a lot. We use the term reflexive, right, quite often to describe things, especially to describe the way that sometimes objects have changed. And I wonder, like, what do we think that the term reflexive is versus something like being self-aware? And then maybe we can delve a little bit into what that means for objects and how objects evolved.
Well, yeah, I don't think an object is self-aware.
Right.
I mean, that's just nonsense. So there's an immediate distinction there, that we're not going to talk about an object as, say, observing us, because we really think that the object is actually looking at us.
Right.
It has to sort of think about John Adams's imaginary audience.
Yeah.
You can almost imagine that an object also has an imaginary audience, except we're the imaginary audience of the object.
Right.
So there's this fabulous reversal, and that it's not us who are the most important.
Yeah.
Who are the great human beings, in that very classical sense, who do all the stuff and have the ultimate agency and organize everything and make all the big decisions. Suddenly, with the birth of this object, right, the commodity, whatever you want to call it, you have this fabulous reversal.
Yeah.
And now we're the imaginary audience, which means we're part of like the symbolic universe of objects.
Yeah.
We have to, as a consequence, try and fit ourselves into market society, if you can imagine that. We have to try and, for instance, take labor, which of course will get hotly contested in the 19th century, but even earlier, because labor as a concept is also, of course, born in the 13th century, or, in and around this time when it becomes possible to give a value to an hour of a person's time. People therefore have to really start fitting into a society that is not being built by humans for humans.
Yeah.
Long before AI, you have this sort of, can we call it the object society, the society of objects?
Totally.
This kind of materialism seems to have this kind of excess to it, which means we don't have the privilege of controlling it. And it's precisely because we are, again, part of the symbolic universe. We're members of the imaginary audience of this sort of market materiality.
Right, because there's sometimes people say, if you read like certain philosophers, like I have some things here from like Baudrillard, who says things about like, the object stares back. And that's the important thing to distinguish between, something like reflexive versus self-aware, is like not literally, but it's almost like we're looking at ourselves through this thing, right? And so I'm like my follow-up question was going to be something like, are we projecting awareness onto the object? But it almost seems like it's more structural. Like you can't not do that. Like it wasn't really a willful thing. It was like as a part of this system of, commodification or objectivity or whatever. It's like they don't actually watch us, right, under capitalism, but they almost appear to. And so I wonder, I know. There's like, Marx writes about the sort of like the use value and the exchange value, but then people like Baudrillard and other people will say that there's like a sign value, right? So like an easy way of thinking about this is, there's like your phone, your clothes, whatever, like status symbols in some ways are, you'd think like, oh, but that's people thinking that about me. But in some ways, it's also the way that you think about yourself, right? If I have like a fashionable shirt, then I'm fashionable. And so it's almost like you are looking at yourself through the object. And it's like the object knows something about you, right? And so in this way, it's like I think the Baudrillard thing is like the object is perfect because it sends back not real images but desired images, right? And I think this kind of gets back to that a little bit.
Well, let's zero in on maybe this idea of the object sort of knows something about me. I think that the object doesn't know anything about me because that doesn't make any sense. It's nonsense. It doesn't have any actual information about me.
Right.
Again, I think one thing that I think someone like Baudrillard is a little bit inclined to miss, and especially when you start talking about desire in a certain way, is that, okay, materiality already exists. That's not the thing we're talking about. What we're talking about is a kind of surveillance society.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is, oh, no, the really subversive thing about commerce, about capitalism, about commercial society, is that there's this kind of embedded project of surveillance. And this is why it's so offensive to the human being. You know, in the sense, this is a kind of, you know, Marx didn't go far enough. It wasn't enough to talk about, you know, terrible labor conditions in factories. You had to sort of get at something, because we're not working in factories, but we still want to complain. So what is it? Well, it's this counter surveillance.
Right.
But I think that why I find that a little bit nonsensical is, again, there's no actual information. You know, Kafka, for instance, the writer, spent a long time trying to create literary metaphors. The castle, the trial, you know, where where his whole point was, there isn't actually a monster at the end of the tunnel. There isn't actually a really existing authority engaging in an act of surveillance.
Yeah.
What there is the feeling. Okay, the feeling of being surveyed. Now that maybe we can work with, but then let's take our past description. If we're part of the imaginary audience of the object, which again is a rather uncomfortable position to be in, you know, it's sort of like being in the giant's back pocket.
Right.
Or if you've read, you know, the Odyssey, and when the Cyclops comes back and they have to pretend, I think at one point they even blind him and they have to sort of pretend to be something that they're not, but they're in the giant's lair. That's sort of what we are. We're in the giant's lair, and the giant is not an authority.
Yeah.
It's not again that the giant doesn't know something. On the contrary, we're there. Therefore, not also, I think, looking at the object in order to learn something about ourselves.
Right.
One, because there's nothing to learn. Two, because about ourselves, and two, because the object has nothing to tell us.
Yeah.
It's just about this event that happens, you know, like 700 years ago. It's fun to put a timestamp on it, but like that suddenly something about materiality actually comes into existence naively, and then we're suddenly caught up in that. And there is a virtual program of surveillance only insofar as, well, if I'm part of the imaginary audience, then I feel like I'm being spoken to.
Right. Well, that was why I was originally going to ask, you know, are we projecting awareness onto the object? But it's almost like something structural makes us behave as if it's watching us.
But careful with the word behavior, because this is a category of externalism. And again, we want to have something that won't make us say that materialism happened as an event.
Right.
Where we can say, okay, well, it's our behavior. So there we have something real.
Yeah.
Because it's our behavior acting in a certain way. Oh, we're kind of pantomimes. So, okay, we're still real. No, my thesis here is we are less real than objects. And until we're ready to sort of start with that, there's going to be no political point at which we're going to find what the real crime is, so to speak, of markets or capitalism or commerce or, again, decades of French philosophy exercise to try and figure out the exact hypocrisy of power relations. I think a lot of this was a little bit of a failure precisely because it assumes that there's something real enough that can be hurt, whereas the really mysterious, kind of uncanny and frankly horrifying thing is that there's nothing real enough to be hurt. And that on the contrary, we owe our concept of reality to the commodity.
Yeah.
And I mean this seriously. we moderns have a 360-degree concept of reality. That is entirely how we experience nature, materiality, and reality itself.
Right.
It's not like those things are just over in the corner and we have certain concepts of them, or again, we project certain things onto them. No, they don't exist themselves without engaging in some kind of, if you can imagine it, projection of their own.
Right.
But rather than it being that, nature has a nice projection, the Mother Nature knows what to do, this kind of balanced way of looking at things, this holistic organization of the cosmic forces or whatever. No, it's like a sort of, Freud would call it the devouring mother. It's a system that has no idea what to do,
right,
and yet nonetheless can project its own desires onto us.
Right.
So far from us projecting our desires onto it, we get certain desires. And the ultimate desire, I would argue, that we got from it is one, probably actually the category of desire itself to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly maybe 360 desire, commercial desire or desire as something materialistic.
Right.
Desire as something that can be satisfied by an object, as opposed to, say, there being a dissatisfaction that long pre-exists a society of objects, or again, the implosive or negative effects of a counter-surveilling object that gives us a sort of fake or artificial scarcity, and then that's the big problem, is that we have fake desires. No. The problem is that we're seeded with desire itself, that we have material reality and a 360-degree concept of reality, which is probably the most real version of reality that human beings have ever had.
Mm-hmm.
And no wonder we became addicted to it through markets for 700 years, because it's not just that we couldn't think of anything better. It's like there isn't anything better.
Right. It gave us that. It's like in some ways, you think like the iPhone itself, like you give it this value of as if it's being watched, right? As if it's like a subject, because we ascribe meaning to it in this way, or people would think that that's it, right? That's the really devilish nature of it. But it's like, but we only have that ability to ascribe things even to ourselves through the object, right? Like the object participates in your self-performance in this way that maybe you're not even aware of. In fact, like it like you as a subject become reflexive of the object rather than the opposite way, right?
Oh, absolutely. It imposes a reflexivity onto you.
Right.
That this is absolutely why that liberalism, especially the liberalism of the 18th century, right?
Yeah.
The birth of freedom, capital F freedom, in exactly the way in which we mean it. Everyone is a liberal today.
Totally.
I don't care where you stand in the political spectrum, especially after World War II, which was, the 1930s was the last great time when there was a huge spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it included the Nazis, horrifying, but it also included social democrats, and it included, yes, again, communists.
Mm-hmm.
But whether we like it or not, it was a crazy spectrum, and certain parts of that spectrum were trying, however, I think poorly, to fight liberalism.
Right.
So we get from liberalism a radical concept of freedom. Well, why? Because the object imposes a certain reflexivity onto it. We get infected with freedom,
mm-hmm.
right? What Slavoj Žižek calls the disease of freedom, the disease without a cure,
mm-hmm.
right? This is not a fun thing that we get infected with. And
right.
It's precisely the infection of reflexivity. Reflexivity, again, to your earlier question, is not self-awareness, but it's when obviously when the process itself turns on itself.
Right.
If it's not necessarily a question of self-awareness, it's because it's not necessarily a question of consciousness. A question, for instance, can be reflexive if it includes itself. If through the question, I also have a question about the question I'm asking, there's a reflexivity there. And freedom is an unbearable level of reflexivity. Freedom is the capacity to ask questions, but like without almost any goal in mind. It's think about it, it's a totally toxic rapport to have with reality. But here's the thing, just as with markets and commodities, we can't put this toxicity back in the bag. And in fact, in the late 18th century, well into the nationalization movements of the 19th century and well beyond, we were obliged to figure out, okay, how are we going to live with this capital F freedom, right? Which we identify with, okay, yes, liberal commerce and the liberal state and which, was hundreds of years in the making.
Yeah.
But this becomes the radical political responsibility.
So I guess my question is, in what way does the internet, I don't know, tack onto this or provide us like some way out of this, or what does it mean basically in relation to this concept of freedom?
Well, I mean, the internet seems to give us, if I can put it this way, an even better basis for freedom, but not by departing from materiality. Like we get, again, there's obviously an intersection of freedom and materiality.
Yeah.
One, we understand our freedom, let's be honest, commercially. We only have liberal nation states because they're commercial unions. At the same time as you get the birth of, the great unifications of Europe, you get the birth of literally of Germany in the 19th century, Italy, the French Republic or the various French republics, etc. And many other nations, they're also completely subverted by the fact that they're basically just giant commercial unions.
Right.
They're useful to help unify massive amounts of labor, massive amounts of capital, right? So industry, finance, and national power are kind of having a chess game with the people of Europe. And there's a sort of, obviously because this freedom has come out of the bag, you need national structures. For instance, it's one of the political answers for helping people to negotiate their freedom in a commercial society, in a market society. High medieval society, which was a market society, which means an early capitalist society, had sort of different ways, again, of giving people commercial freedom, right? And the beginnings of our property system, of personhood, like they all start with you negotiating with commerce, okay? And with everything else becoming a commercial entity. Like when something becomes commercial, when it becomes negotiable through commerce, through a financial transaction, when you make that crucial departure from feudal vassalage, then you basically have modern freedom. And it is free. Like comparatively, this is unbelievably free from the indentured servitude of the serfs. Or honestly, I think, maybe with certain conditions, it's significantly more free than say, oh, but when I'm a Roman citizen, I get all the privileges of a Roman citizen. Oh, but you better hope then you're born as a Roman citizen.
Yeah. If
not, you're in big trouble. So here's the point then. If commercial society changes, then presumably one of two things happens. Either it changes in a kind of negative way and our freedom is compromised and we have to make a kind of, radical repetition of liberalism. We have to, rejig our economics or, and so as to reconfigure our commercial unions, and we have to figure out, how to have competitive trade, which sounds quite familiar to the political situation, just by the way the establishment is currently waging, I would say, against us at the moment. The other option is, okay, no. Yes, something about commercialism has left. It's sort of 700-year process of market society, commodities and capitalism.
Right.
But it's changed it in an interesting way. And that maybe, just maybe, we have something better than commerce and markets for negotiating negotiating freedom, but also negotiating the human being.
Right. Well, the thing that I always think about the internet, which is so interesting, is like, it's almost like, we talk about these things as like a mirror, but it's almost like more than a mirror, because it's kind of a feedback loop where it's like materiality that talks back in a way. Like the idea to me of metrics that are like, likes, views, comments, shares, whatever, digital signatures or whatever, like you can almost frame things as very real and kind of material through like how many people did this reach, how many people liked it, what are people saying things about it. That to me seems like totally different than, how many people bought this thing, right? Like you're not producing a commercial transaction necessarily. I mean, obviously there's, farming data and all these things, but if you like something or you watch something or you comment something, it's like, what are you actually producing, or how are you actually engaging in a way that does feel very different from, market society or material society or objective, commodified society.
Well, in a sense, when you go on the internet, you're not producing anymore. And this is the difficult concept to try and grasp, because it doesn't mean this reactionary rejection of what we have done in markets for hundreds of years, where we would say, oh, finally, we don't have the baggage of having to work, of having to produce things, and and you get a very abstract freedom. This is not, I think, very rewarding at all as a concept. And yet we still want to qualify something about when I'm on the internet, I'm not producing. So what does that mean? Well, when you look at the like system or the views system, the view counters, and you see how those were made, more than 20 years ago in some cases, Facebook and YouTube, as a way to organize a social revolution, which was the internet society. What does that mean? Well, it means that just as the French revolutionaries had, the French flag, which this is not true, but it's a wonderful thought that the French flag emerged because you had the white of the monarch's flag, which was an actual flag, the blue sky behind it, and then a bit of the blood of the revolutionaries had stained part of the white flag. And you get, of course, the three colors, the triptych. Right. That, while it's not, I think it's apocryphal, but it's a beautiful idea. And it captures something about how political revolutions do have furnishing, right? And this is what we meant earlier by props, by some kind of setting. And again, we argued that materiality and props are one and the same thing. And in a sense, the likes and the view counters and many other examples, thereof were furnishings. But for what? Not another liberal revolution, not another commercial revolution, a great innovation, another industrial product or a product of financial capital, but this kind of revolution that had to do with, we're not necessarily producing anymore on these digital platforms that we're building. And I think that data has emerged more recently as very much, I think, this attempt to re-commercialize the internet.
Totally.
And I think we should be very, very wary of re-commercializing the internet because it seems not just dangerous because it involves injecting, say, needless profiteering onto the platforms, but because, it's much worse, because it's an abject failure to take on the responsibility of this new kind of freedom that exists on the internet.
Yeah, and I wonder, does this get us out of that, whatever we want to call it, like the mute object, right? That we behave as if it can tell us something, but it can't actually tell us something. Whereas the internet, in not necessarily being an object, or a post not necessarily being a commodity or an object, maybe actually can tell us something through these metrics that are divorced from production.
The way I see it is, a little bit different. The way I see it is that with that post, with those likes, with the videos that we make, with the images that we make, so these are kind of the classic parts of what we mean by the digital, by the internet, and there's so many different ways it's a huge rabbit hole, but all those different specific ways that we actually materialize the internet. What I think those do is I think that those produce the information that markets used to produce. And that information is extremely social. Again, take the post. If let's say I organize a social event with a Facebook post. Now, this is a little bit old-fashioned. People don't necessarily do this anymore. Sure. But while you and I are not very old, we're still old enough to know
remember, of course,
when that was a thing. And not just Facebook events that you can organize. No, long before even an event feature existed and you actually had to post something.
Yeah, on your wall when we still had walls.
Exactly. And now, what I'd like to think is that kind of social interaction is possible because something bigger is happening. And this bigger thing has to do with, if we're not necessarily producing commodities, what are we producing? And this, I think, is the part of the jigsaw we haven't really figured out because we seem to have created this big space. This is what the internet is, right? A big space. German director Werner Herzog calls the internet an environment. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it. It's a big, so we've created this huge space, but what the heck are we going to do with it?
Right.
And it's not another commercial space. This, again, I just have to say is a bit of a detour. It's one of my very, 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 very few criticisms of Yanis Varoufakis and the techno-feudal thesis is as true as it is of a critique of certain power relations, of a corruption of the digital. Where is the second half of that book, which says what the digital really is, what it really could be, a very different way of thinking about it, because clearly the idea of the digital as a giant piece of land, as a giant fief, obviously emerges on the back of this idea that we have this big free space,
right?
But which doesn't understand that, one, feudalism is an ancient idea comparatively, liberalism has happened, so how can you possibly attempt to politically suppose that we can turn these things into fiefs. I mean, it's a crazy idea, and it's an impossible idea because you cannot put that kind of freedom back in the box. So the strange idea, and this is the core idea as I see it, is that we'll do this, what I can only call repeating materiality thing. It's not that we just are all going to go on the internet now and do everything on the internet and there's no more, naively really existing society. The way I see it is now we have the opportunity to look at the last 700 years of materialism and say, you mentioned the word decision earlier. Okay, what do we like?
Totally.
What is this thing called materialism?
Right.
Obviously, it won't be, we won't say we like it in the sense that when I go through the grocery store, I get to exercise a commercial right and choose which oranges I want. It's deeper than that. It's sort of as if we've come to the end of this process called materialism. And in a weird way, the ultimate material product is the internet, which for many people is simultaneous, is not actually very material. It's the least present object.
Totally.
But it's also the object that is going to kind of replace objects, at least as far as this big 700-year-old performance is concerned. We have performed, as we mentioned, for the object. We've been its imaginary audience. In fact, all of the architecture, and there's so many examples that we can look at from, again, I've mentioned Siena already, but go look at, sort of post-Reformation architecture, Northern European Protestant architecture. You can look at how we started to build buildings with the idea of this 360 perspective. Buildings that almost knew they were being looked at. These were not sort of like the classical buildings, which might have housed gods or reflected, beautiful ideas of proportion.
Right.
These buildings are a little bit more uncanny is the only way I can describe them. They had perspective written into them, 360 perspective written into them. In fact, in the history of art, people will know that linear perspective is born at basically at the same time as market society is born. In around the 13th century, people start to use literally the concept of a third dimension, where before, for instance, in Italy, there had been a style of Byzantine art which was all two-dimensional. Like, these are not sort of, trivial parts of art history or architectural history. These are like serious moments when something changes in the kind of literal coordinate system of reality. And again, not humans, not our transcendentalization of reality, not our image of it or our epistemic description or projection. No, again, we are, if anything, in the imaginary audience of this sort of suddenly emerging 360-degree view that can come in the form of an object. So the question then is whether or not we can say, okay, can we do any of these material practices that we have done without the performance and fiction of market society and of commerce? And it's a very strange idea, because what it obviously means is that we don't necessarily, need something like economics, which is a pseudoscience. It's been a very good pseudoscience. It's been a very good fiction. It's helped us coordinate, exactly, the science of a certain kind of difficult to coordinate relationship between liberal freedom and the commercial practices that basically make that freedom coherent. But it's also contributed this kind of pantomime that there are really existing yields, really existing concepts of productivity, that objects are really existing things as opposed to, say, materials. Materiality, as opposed to being this sort of update to the coordinate system of reality. We've tried to think of them as these kind of sublime objects, right? To quote Slavoj Žižek, these things that are not just objects, but these kind of bigger, larger than life things that seem to, again, embody desire. But most of these portrayals, what they're trying to capture, obviously, is this sort of excess that the object has, and that we feel like we are in the imaginary audience of the object. And so, of course, the effect upon us is to have this sense that the object is larger than life, even though it really isn't. It's just that the structure of reality includes, if you can imagine this, an imaginary audience. Reality also needs certain imaginary structures in order for it to be kind of coherent, in order for it to kind of work. And so the question then, again, is whether or not the internet can help facilitate this big repetition.
And well, what do we think, I guess, in some ways, an internet society versus a market society, or internet values versus market values looks like. Because just as you said, Werner Herzog said that there's like this idea of it as an environment. I've definitely seen like the idea of the internet as like a signal ecology, right? Where there's like every post and all these things are part of ranking, visibility, traceability, performance in this way that is, kind of divorced from what we would have as traditional signals, right? Price signals, yield signals, all of these things. So what do we think like a society or a reality or a politics based on the internet and based on those kinds of a repetition with those kinds of signals would differ from what we maybe have now or what we're heading towards?
I think that the word signal is a very market idea. I think that, for instance, you think about signal and you think about a price signal.
Mm-hmm.
You think about a piece of information that is considered necessary to coordinate a process. Here's an interesting definition of freedom, something that isn't necessary. Are we ready for a political society in which decision-making is based on something which is not necessary, which you do not have to decide upon in a certain way? Right now, we use, again, economics and ideology of commercial society to enforce a kind of participation almost under duress. Whether it's the features of debt in our society or, these sort of symptomatic wars, we seem to be, there's a bargain here. We weren't necessarily at the table negotiating. And this seems in a weird way actually to get back to signals. Signals is sort of like an anthropological idea too, this idea that we're going back to the wild and there are natural signals. Trust me, economics loves this idea. They love the idea of really existing scientific signals for the communication of reality. But isn't the entire point of market materialism and now the internet, which I just consider basically an extension of markets, it's such an extension that it changes what markets have always been. So it's not a kind of gradual extension of markets. But these things seem to really upset the naive idea of nature, the naive idea of any kind of signaling system. And so signals to me like, this idea that there's patterns on the internet. Well, what's the point of these patterns? So I can come up with an equation, and with that equation I can describe human relations? Sorry, this is what the moral science, as it used to be known, the moral psychology of economics was in the late 18th century. It was literally an attempt to describe human behavior according to signals, except the signals were now markets. So I don't know if signals are our friend. I think that information is an interesting word. I think that the fact that we will produce information, the fact that there's some kind of concept of the Google society, back to the concept of the book. I think that one of the weird contradictions with do I read the book or do I go on Google is, well, is Google just information? Is it possible for us to distinguish between a book that gives us a kind of embodied story that I take with me on the metro and a book that, or something like a Wikipedia page that just has information? Is that all the internet is? A bit of information, sort of more of that 360 information? I think it's something more. And the only way I can explain it is to take the briefest detour through philosophy, but it's entirely understandable. And it's a concept that again comes from Slavoj Žižek when he says that in the German philosopher Hegel's description of the movement from understanding to reason, the movement from understanding is the collection of all of our knowledge categories towards reason, the engine itself of our thinking, the kind of holy grail, as it were, of intellectual pursuit. Žižek makes this wonderful point apropos of Hegel. He says, for Hegel, the movement from understanding towards reason involves subtracting from understanding a fantasy of reason, a capital R reason. In other words, reason is just understanding that doesn't have the supportive fiction of a reason that it's heading towards. Is this not a perfect description of the movement from market to internet society? What is the difference? I don't want to argue it's a kind of Varoufakisian markets without capitalism. In any internet society, markets will have a seriously reduced role. There's no question, because their role will be significantly deflated. We will not believe that they have this information that we're waiting to hear. But nonetheless, we'll still have the kind of uncanny structure of materiality. We'll still have materialism, except this materialism will exist without the fantasy of our participation in markets, of there being some ultimate end to the coordination of human production, of human profit, of value, of surplus value, of capital. I think that the political opportunity we have now is to subtract these ideologies and sort of look at materialism for the first time.